Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. A while ago I covered the Pit of Despair experiment and the video seemed to do pretty well, so today I thought I'd cover some more disturbing psychological experiments. The Pit of Despair was an attempt to create depression in an otherwise healthy rhesus macaque, and since then there's been other experiments that attempt to simulate depressive symptoms in animals. One of these is the Learned Helplessness experiment, conducted in 1967 by psychologists Stephen Meyer and Martin Seligman. The experiment was to study whether someone can learn that a situation is hopeless and then retain this hopeless mindset in situations where a solution is clearly visible. To demonstrate this, they took a number of beagles and split them into 3 groups. The dogs from each group were put into a special harness that allowed them to stand but prevented them from walking away. The dogs in Group 1 were the control animals. Apart from the harness, they were subjected to no other treatment. The dogs in Group 2 were stood on a metal platform that would administer electric shocks at random. In front of the dogs was a button that they could press with their nose, and this would stop the electric shocks. The dogs in Group 3 were also given shocks, but this time there was no button for them to press. They were helpless to the tortures of the electrified floor. Once each group had undergone the harness treatment, they were placed into a special box. The box was split into 2 halves, each with an electrified floor. A low wall separated the 2 halves. Scientists would electrify one half of the box. To escape the shocks, the dogs would simply have to jump over the low wall into the other half. As predicted, the dogs in Group 1 and 2 easily escaped the electrocutions by hopping over the wall. The dogs in Group 3, however, had learned that it was hopeless to attempt to escape. They simply stood there in the electrified half, resigned to their fate. Escape from their pain would have involved a simple jump over a small wall, but they couldn't comprehend that they might be able to help themselves. It was an important discovery in learned behaviour, but for the dogs involved it must have seemed a particularly cruel and unusual punishment. An earlier experiment in learned behaviour comes from 1920, and this one involved a human subject. The Little Albert experiment was a study in how the human mind develops phobias, how we learn what to be afraid of. A 9-month-old baby, known only as Albert, was introduced to a number of stimuli. He was given a white rat, a rabbit, and a dog to play with. He was also shown people in different masks and disguises. Little Albert showed minor reaction to these things, except mild interest. He certainly wasn't afraid of any of them. The experimenters then placed him on a mat with a steel pole hanging from a frame behind him. They brought the white rat back in and placed it on the floor in front of him. Every time curious little Albert reached out to touch the rat, somebody would hit the steel pole, causing a loud noise that gave Albert a fright. Pretty soon he began to associate the rat with the fear emotion. Now, whenever the rat was placed near him, Albert would cry and try to crawl away from the creature. They had successfully given Albert a phobia of rats, which he didn't have days before. There were some unexpected outcomes though. Not only did Albert develop a phobia of rats, but of any small furry object. He would now display the same fear response to rabbits and dogs. Even stuff like cotton wool and Santa's beard would set him off. The sad thing is, when the experiments were over, nothing was done to try and reverse the process, to help Albert unlearn his fears. The test was ended and Albert was sent back to his mother, new phobias and all. Whatever happened to Albert after that is still a matter of debate. His mother moved away and his real name has always been kept secret. Quite recently it was discovered that a man named William Barger was born around the right time and place to have been Little Albert. His mother also worked in the same building where the experiment was conducted. Although his name was William, he was always called by his middle name, Albert. Unfortunately, he died in 2007, aged 87, and most likely he wouldn't have been aware of being part of a psychological experiment. But family members always mentioned how he had a terrible fear of dogs and other small animals that persisted into old age. There's been a number of psychological experiments that look at the effects of coercive control and people's willingness to obey authority figures. The idea that people can be convinced to ignore their own morals just to obey the orders of someone in a senior position. Milgram's shock experiment is quite well known already, so I won't go into too much detail here, but for people who don't know about it, in 1961 a psychologist called Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments to see how willing people would be to follow orders even if it meant causing harm to another person. After the horrors of World War II, he wanted to see how normal human beings could be convinced to commit terrible acts. The experiment consisted of two people sitting in separate rooms with a psychologist watching over them. One of those people was hooked up to electrodes, and the other was given a machine that could administer electric shocks to the person in the other room. The person with the electrodes attached would be asked a series of questions, and if they got the question wrong, the psychologist would tell the other person to give them an electric shock. As the experiment goes on, the strength of the electric shock becomes stronger and stronger until they seem to be actually harming the person receiving the shocks. The person starts to shout for help, begging for the shocks to stop. The one administering the shocks might start to protest, but the psychologist simply tells them to continue. Most of the time they would continue shocking the other person until they seemingly killed them, all because an authority figure told them to. Of course, the person receiving the shocks was an actor. The electrocution machine wasn't actually hooked up to anything, but the person dishing out the shocks didn't know this, and oftentimes they were convinced that they'd badly injured or even killed another human being. As I say, this experiment is quite famous, but what isn't so well known is the experiments conducted afterwards. See, there was a suspicion that the test subjects might be able to work out that the guy in the other room was acting. To get a true measure of human nature, they would need to be giving shocks to a real victim. In 1972, psychologists Charles Sheridan and Richard King decided to run Milgram's experiment again, but this time instead of having an actor receive the shocks, it was a small puppy. Similar to the learned helplessness experiment, the dog was placed into a box with a metal floor. The dog was supposed to stand on either side of the box, depending on where a flashing light appeared. People were brought in and sat in front of a device with 10 buttons, each one delivering an increasingly strong shock to the puppy. Whenever the puppy stood in the wrong place, the psychologist would inform the person to press the button and give the dog a shock. Naturally, the puppy would scream in pain from the punishment. The people delivering the shocks would often start crying and beg the scientists to release the animal. The psychologist would simply tell them to continue with the experiment, and in the vast majority of cases they did. Out of 26 people tested, only 6 of them stopped the experiment and refused to shock the puppy. Another experiment that shows obedience to authority was conducted decades earlier in 1921 by University of Minnesota student Carney Landis. As part of his doctoral research, he wanted to study people's facial expressions. The experiment was quite simple. He would take various test subjects and paint dark lines on their face. He would then subject them to various situations that would make them feel different emotions. Then he would photograph them to see how their facial expressions changed. He would do things like make them listen to jazz music, he had them tell a lie, he showed them pictures of diseases and made them smell ammonia. Each time he'd get a different reaction and a different photograph. The final part of the experiment, though, involved a live animal. In front of the test subjects, he placed a live rat and a large butcher's knife. He told them to hold the rat in one hand and behead it with the knife. If anyone refused, Landis would grab the rat and behead it himself. After all, he wanted to record their reaction. The strange thing is, though, hardly anyone refused to cooperate. Even when they cried and protested over being made to kill a live creature, most of them proceeded with just the mildest of encouragement from Landis. 2/3 of the people tested agreed to behead the rodents, including a 13-year-old boy who was already suffering from psychological issues. I have to wonder how being made to behead a live animal affected his mental health afterwards. From these photos, it seems clear that he wasn't enjoying the ordeal. Finally, I want to look at a sleep deprivation experiment. As you may know, sleep deprivation is one of the most effective torture techniques. Even just a few days without sleep can be enough to convince someone to confess to crimes that they never even committed. To subject a defenseless animal to this treatment can be difficult, even for the scientist. In 1894, some Russian psychologists, who I'm probably going to mispronounce the names of, conducted one of the earliest known experiments into the importance of sleep. Maria Manessina and Ivan Tarkanov took 10 puppies and deprived them of sleep through the use of constant activity. They also took another group of puppies and allowed them to sleep, but deprived them of food. Strangely, after 4 or 5 days, the sleep-deprived puppies died, whereas the food-deprived puppies could last 20 days or more. They concluded from their studies that sleep was as important as food for a person's health. The problem was, conducting such an experiment left a psychological mark on the experimenters. Keeping 10 puppies awake for days on end was extremely difficult. Maria described it as being a very painful process, both for the scientists and for the puppies. Since then, there's been a number of other sleep deprivation experiments on dogs. Each time the result was the same. Without sleep, the dogs' brains would shut down and they would quickly die. The longest a dog survived without sleep was about 2 weeks. I hate to think what it endured in those 2 weeks to make it stay awake all that time. The results are clear though. Sleep is important, so if you're watching this video at 3 AM, then maybe you should try and get some rest. As I said in my Pit of Despair video, I don't really know where I stand on these sorts of experiments. A lot of them seem excessively cruel, but sometimes it's hard to judge the past with the ethics of today, and these studies often gave data that went on to help a lot of people. Whether the ends justified the means is a moral judgment I'll leave up to you. Thanks for watching the video. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you're new to this channel, then please consider subscribing. Huge thanks as usual to everyone supporting the channel on PayPal and Patreon. I wouldn't be able to make this content without you, and your support is highly appreciated. If you'd also like to support our channel, then check out the link on screen now. Otherwise, you could simply give the video a thumbs up. That helps me out quite a lot too. Thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.